The Pakistani grooming gang scandal has rocked Great Britain to its very core, throwing into doubt the entire progressive project of mass migration. The young girls of Britain were the first to pay the price, assaulted in numbers almost inconceivable. This great calamity remains a filthy stain on the British state and a filthy stain on British history. And a deeper, darker, redder stain on British honor. This is part one of a two-part series. Make sure you leave a like.
It's a problem that's plagued several UK cities. Gangs of predominantly British Pakistani men targeting vulnerable white young women and girls.
On a daily basis I was being beaten, raped and emotionally just completely shut down.
Sammy Woodhouse was one of 1,400 children sexually exploited in Rotherham alone. She chose to waive her anonymity to campaign to stop it happening.
White girls were viewed, as I say, just as a piece of meat, as though where they're just a sex object that, you know, they can do anything towards us, that we deserve it. There's no respect there. They don't view us as people.
10 years after that report, Sky News is still running erroneous stories like this in a sick attempt to muddy the waters concerning this phenomenon, even after they knew it had been happening for decades. Strategic Culture Foundation. Yes, the grooming gangs were Pakistani. The grooming gang scandal in the UK is one of the darkest chapters of the country's history. For years, thousands of young, white British girls were abused by PDF-file Pakistani blank gangs across the UK.
I can't tell you how many rapes that I've had.
When I was still 14, Andrea took me to the promenade in the town where we met the Pakistani kebab house workers, and then 5 or 6 of them gang raped me.
I was locked in there for 10 weeks.
You know, I'm this 14-year-old kid. I didn't even know that was physically possible to do to a person.
Early attempts by some to bring it to light went nowhere, as all levels of the UK regime engaged in a systemic cover-up to hide the abuses. In recent days, attention has been focused on this episode, with the abominable details of the abuse suffered by young white victims archived in the harrowing court transcripts of their abusers' trials, spreading across X with the help from the signal boost of an outraged Elon Musk.
Elon Musk has turned his attention back to what is going on in the UK. You may remember Elon Musk, when he discovered about the Pakistani rape gangs, that was it. He made sure that was firmly back on the agenda. In America, first time they had heard of it, they couldn't quite believe it. But in the UK as well, all the politicians running around going, oh no, it's terrible, oh dear, but we can't have a national inquiry. And they, oh no, we think there should be a national inquiry. Well, he's taken some time out to chuck some kit in the stratosphere, and now he's back on fighting for justice for the victims of grooming gangs, and he wants to go after officials who he alleges are corrupt, who swept this stuff under the carpet and covered up the crimes of the grooming gangs. He said, I'd like to help fund legal actions against corrupt officials who aided and abetted the rape of Britain per the official government inquiry. It came as an unofficial inquiry into grooming gangs led by Rupert Lowe, claim it had found child sexual exploitation in 85 local authorities across Britain.
This morning, he said you should be in prison. You're a lawyer. That sounds libelous.
Once we lose the anchor that truth matters in the robust debate we must have, then we're on a very slippery slope. But it ought to matter, and it used to matter, to all political parties. And it's a sign of where the Tory party have got to, that we're even having this debate.
Reports of systematic child abuse by gangs first started 25.
The cover-up of the racial nature of this crime has been twofold. First, British authorities, including social workers and police, avoided prosecuting the matter because they feared it would inflame racial tensions. Were it revealed that Pakistani gangs were targeting white British girls.
There's an awful lot of senior police officers who need to hang their heads in shame because they were too scared to confront the uncomfortable truth. They were too timid and frightened to be accused of racism because they would not go into particular communities that had a penchant for this revolting, disgusting behaviour whereby they plied young girls with drink, drugs groomed them, raped them, sexually abused them for years, and got away with it for years, sometimes forever.
Second, since the scandal has come to light, establishment media has tried to downplay the overwhelming overrepresentation of Pakistanis and claim grooming gangs were primarily a white phenomenon. In 2020, the mouthpieces of the British regime ran a flood of articles with the message, most child abuse sexual gangs made up of white men, Home Office report says, wrote The Guardian. Establishment media was suddenly happy to discuss the episode. Now it had an official government report that showed the racists had been lying to everyone all along. What did this report say that put the claims of the racists to bed? Quote, a number of high-profile cases, including the offending in Rotherham investigated by Professor Alexis J., the Rothschild Group convicted as an operation of Span, and convictions in Telford, have mainly involved men of Pakistani ethnicity. Beyond specific high-profile cases, the academic literature highlights the significant limitations to what can be said about links between ethnicity and this form of offending. Research has found that group-based CSE, child sex exploitation offenders, are most commonly white. Some studies suggest an overrepresentation of black and Asian offenders relative to the demographic of the national population. However, it is not possible to conclude that this is representative of all group-based CSE offending. The Home Office report here cites Barrow-Licks, etc., 2012. A look at this report titled The Office of the Children's Commissioner's Inquiry into Child Sexual Exploitation in Gangs and Groups produces the following results on racial representation. As stated earlier, children were not always able to provide accurate accounts of ethnicities of all their abusers. Given that only 3% of evidence submissions could provide full perpetrator data and that 68% of submissions did not provide any perpetrator data, the chart below must be viewed with caution as the picture is incomplete. Based on the call for evidence submissions, the ethnicity of identified perpetrators was reported as follows. 26% of submissions provided information on a total of 1,514 perpetrators, although for 21% of these cases, the ethnicity of the perpetrator was not provided. Where the ethnicity of perpetrators was provided, 545 were recorded as white, 415 were recorded as Asian, and 244 recorded as black. So the Asian perpetrators were 415 out of 1,514 cases where ethnicity could be identified, or 27.4%. In 2011, Asians, being Bangladeshis, Pakistanis, Indians, were 6.8% of the British population. This means Asians were overrepresented by a factor of 4 times.
The vast majority of child sex abuse offenders across the country are British white men. In this Rotherham scandal, the National Crime Agency says that the majority of suspects, and I quote, are of Asian appearance. What do you make of that?
I gave evidence to Parliament about this some years ago. The reality is that where you have street grooming of the type that we're talking about in Rotherham, as we did in Rochdale and Oxford and other parts of the country, Asians and Pakistanis are disproportionately involved in this. I've tried to understand it myself by looking at the demography, looking at the nighttime economy, and I've asked for several people to carry out some research and correlations into what's happening. The reality is, though, that in street grooming, Asians are disproportionately involved. And that's an issue not just for the authorities, it's an issue for the communities.
So you'd agree with, what seems on the face of it a pretty bold statement by Sarah Champion, the local MP, the Rotherham MP. She says there's very clearly a problem in Rotherham with Pakistani males. We need to deal with that head on, and ethnicity should have no bearing on the law. Do you agree with that?
Sarah's absolutely right. The fact is, however, when it comes to street grooming, Asians are disproportionately involved. But as you said, most child victims are victims in the home or institutions or online, and they will be the perpetrators there will be white males. But let's say it again, Asians and Pakistani men are disproportionately involved in street grooming.
And as a British Pakistani Muslim yourself, are you worried about taking such a robust stance on this?
No, I brought the Rochdale prosecution. I led nationally on these prosecutions. It's absolutely essential that the Muslim community, the Pakistani community, carry their own stick and deal with these issues. These perpetrators have been allowed to get away with it for far too long, sadly, and victims have suffered for far too long. And my point is that justice delayed is better than justice denied.
Whites, as 545 out of 1,514 perpetrators, represent 36% in this data. Whites were 86% of the British population in 2011, meaning they are underrepresented by 0.4. This means that even in the report cited by the Home Office report, Asians were approximately 9.6 times more represented in group child sex exploitation compared to whites. This 27% figure for Asians is similar to the 28% number identified by Child Exploitation Online Protection Report in 2011, which is the other major study cited in the Home Office report. But this number is actually much higher. CEOP says 38% of perpetrators in its sample size were unidentified, while 28% were Asian. This means 45% of identified perpetrators in the CEOP report are Asian, an astronomical overrepresentation. It is also worth considering for the Barrelit study that the ethnic breakdown was based on a small number of cases. In the vast majority of cases, an ethnicity could not be identified, given that identifying a native Englishman as English would presumably be a lot easier for a child than identifying whether someone was African, Caribbean, Middle Eastern, or Asian. I think it's very reasonable to assume that whites are largely overrepresented among the identified number. There is also the fact that evidence by Rotherham and other grooming gang scandals that if a perpetrator is non-white, authorities are more likely to hide the race of the perpetrator, something which may impact some of these data sets too. Thus, if we had data that was not reliant on child victims successfully identifying the ethnicity of their predators, whites are likely not even a plurality of perpetrators, despite making up over 86% of the population at that time. But even these numbers are misleading. While these reports are all about cases of group-based child sexual exploitation, the PDF file blank gang rings that emerged in places like Rotherham were something quite unique in the scale of abuse and number of victims. There are 1,415 cases in the data above, mostly individuals, but in Rotherham alone, 1,500 girls were abused, dwarfing most of the cases in the Home Office reports combined. In Telford, at least 1,000 girls were abused by Pakistanis. In Oxford, Huddersfield, Aylesbury, and Rochdale, the victimizers were Pakistani and the victims white.
But except that if we extrapolate nationally, the J report on Rotherham and other reports on Telford and Oxford, there appear to have been upwards of 250,000 young white girls raped in this century, very largely by Muslim men. And given these girls are usually raped several times a day for years, so, my lords, what is the government's answer to the Chief Constable of Northumbria, who has just said that there is every likelihood that these grooming gangs are operating in every one of our major cities? So, my lords, what is the government doing to prosecute those in authority who turned a blind eye to all this because they were afraid of being Islamophobic and so on? And what is it doing to compensate and help these victims mentally?
Why did a Home Office report released in 2020 cite studies using data from the early 2000s when the exposure of these grooming gangs did not come until after the period studied? They could, for example, have cited a 2018 study on group child sex exploitation focused on the more relevant period that determined offenders were 84% Asian. This matches up perfectly with a report by Quilliam that focused specifically on the grooming gang phenomenon and found that 84% of people convicted of this specific grooming gang crimes in the UK in a period after 2005 were Asian.
The Quilliam Foundation study found that 84% of all people convicted since 2005 for the specific crime of gang grooming, as opposed to abuse by individuals, were Asian, as our North of England correspondent Sally Lockwood reports.
High-profile cases like Rotherham have generated negative headlines about the Asian community. But the most recent case in Newcastle, where 17 men and 1 woman were convicted of nearly 100 offences, changed the debate. The judge said it wasn't racially motivated. One MP writing to the Attorney General calling for a review. Think tank the Quilliam Foundation has investigated this issue in a bid to add a strong voice from the British Pakistani community to the debate.
I'm from Rochdale. I'm from the heart of where one of the biggest high-profile cases have happened over the last few years. And I'm saying that it's very, very important that we do talk about it, because the problem won't go away. We didn't want there to be a lot of cases. We didn't want there to be a pattern of people from our ethnic demographic carrying out these attacks. But unfortunately, we were proven wrong.
Their findings found 264 people have been convicted of gang grooming since 2005. Of those offenders, 222 were Asian. That's 84%. But the last record of lone offenders who target children as a result of sexual interest was in 2012, and it showed 100% of them were white. Grooming convictions spiked under Nazir Afzal's tenure as Chief Crown Prosecutor for the North West. He says not talking about the issue of ethnicity is more dangerous, but it also needs context.
The reality is the far right use this as their #1 recruiting tool. They use this issue to recruit more far-right activists, and that's why we need to do something about it. British white men, they tend to work individually. They tend to work online where they groom, and they are the majority of perpetrators. But when it comes to British Pakistani men or Asian men, they tend to do it in groups of this nature.
While this report raises complex cultural issues, it says by not talking about it, we're failing the victims. Sally Lockwood, Sky News.
When the Home Office did a more relevant study on the characteristics of the grooming gangs in 2020, it refused to release it because it determined it was not in the public interest. Another aspect of the abuse the media has worked hard to cover up is the racial hatred that motivated the abusers. Victims reported being called white slags and white blanks as they were beaten and blanked by Pakistani men.
This grooming gang survivor calls what happened to her anti-Western, religious and racist abuse.
When I was a victim, I was raped multiple times, I was beaten, I was tortured, and throughout all of that I was constantly being racially abused. There was a constant barrage of you're a white slag, you're a white whore, you're a fucking gori, which is the Pakistani word for white person. So the racist abuse was non-stop. The religious abuse is real. I was taught it as a type of othering, like our Pakistani girls are good and pure and they cover themselves, they're virgins till they're married, but white girls are trash, they're whores, they all sleep with hundreds of men, they're all worthless. I don't think it's good to hide this information.
The so-called Casey report on Rotherham found that the majority of abusers were Pakistani who selected white victims. This was a matter of fact that the Rotherham Council intentionally avoided because there was a race issue here. As well as the overrepresentation of Pakistanis as abusers, their sheer number relative to the size of these communities raises questions of the complicity of larger communities in the abuse. In Rotherham, for example, only about 8,000 people were Pakistani in a town where 1,500 girls were systemically abused by Pakistanis. It's hard to imagine there was not complicity from many members of the community who have never faced criminal charges. Unsurprisingly, reports have repeatedly confirmed a pattern of Pakistani community leaders facilitating the abuse. Parveen Qureshi, a Pakistani community worker in Rotherham, reported to the BBC that Muslim leaders fully aware of the problem did nothing, and it was always discussed in the community. What explains this shocking overrepresentation of Pakistani migrants in these crimes? Here, the left's search for socioeconomic blame factors for all problems runs into a brick wall. These men were the sons of immigrants. They didn't face any great racism or persecution in the UK. They lived with affluence greater than the vast majority of their kin in Pakistan. No, this was a problem brought from Pakistan, where at least 550,000 children are blanked annually. In a 2020 report, found that 17% of a sample of Pakistani students have been victims of childhood sexual abuse. 72% were under the age of 13, and 80% of cases were incestuous. A study by a governmental ministry in Pakistan's neighbor of India found that 53% of 12,447 children interviewed had been sexually abused. In the midst of this debate, popular English historian Tom Holland reiterated his belief that it was a noble goal for authorities to cover up the grooming gangs, giving that it was with the intention of preserving good race relations, a microcosm of the twisted mindset that allowed an abuse scandal this large to be concealed for years.
As somebody who represents a large and diverse community myself, I have to say that it would be the Pakistani part of my community who have been most fervent in wanting the truth to come out, because there is harm to them that has been done by the the alleged wokeness that has been talked about. And I take this opportunity as well as I finish this statement to say that we not just have to make sure that we have the facts and not feel squeamish about the perpetrators, but I want to say that I have met victims of this crime. In fact, on 6 a.m. on Monday morning, victims of this crime who are black, white, Asian, and we mustn't be silencing those victims by only ever talking about one type of victim. The victimhood in group-based abuse is not just one type.
Do you think there is a specific problem with British Asian men and perhaps specifically British Pakistani men and group child sexual exploitation?
Some British Pakistani men, yes, there is it doesn't matter what I think, the evidence is there. What she has looked at, admittedly, just in 3 police force areas in the review, found an overrepresentation of Asian or British Pakistani origin males. It doesn't matter how I feel about that, those are the facts. And if we ignore that, how can we ever come up with solutions?
It feels like at the heart of this is misogyny.
Of course, they're all men, aren't they? That's the other characteristic that all of these abusers have.
Liberals love to talk about the banality of evil and tell morality tales about good people doing evil in service of an ideology or social pressure. These tales are usually fiction. It's hard to think of a more disturbing real-life example than the respected liberal intellectuals like Holland offering tens of thousands of English girls up on the altar of diversity.
Our diversity is our greatest strength. Our diversity is our greatest strength in this country.
Diversity is America's greatest strength. Diversity to diversity, 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 diversity.
In that diversity that we have achieved so much strength.
Absolute minority. That's not a bad thing. That's a source of our strength. We need to remember that diversity is our strength.
To me, the values of diversity, equality, inclusion, are literally, and that's not kidding, the core strengths of America.
That our diversity is the strength of this nation.
We believe our diversity makes us stronger.
At NATO,
diversity
is our strength.
Our diversity is a strength.
Of our greatest strengths derive from the diversity.
Our diversity is our strength.
Diversity is one of America's greatest strengths.
Our diversity provides strength.
Our diversity is our greatest strength.
Diversity is our strength.
Canada's diversity is our strength.
No, diversity is a strength.
We believe diversity is our strength.
Diversity is diversity.
Diversity is our strength.
The diversity.
The term diversity is our greatest strength has become a sort of sacred faith-based mantra, and if you dare to criticize it, you've committed an act of heresy. But each time I question someone and I will say, show me the evidence. Where is the proof that diversity is our greatest strength? They never can. Once in a while you'll hear, oh, look at the restaurants and the food. Well, the only response to that risible question is Rowan Atkinson, who said, well, we have the recipes now, don't we? The reality is diversity, especially the super diversity we have because of mass immigration, is our greatest weakness. And it's not me saying that. All of the economic and sociological evidence point this way. In 2019, Danish scholars did a meta-analysis of all 87 studies into diversity, and they showed that increased diversity leads to a lowering in social trust, it leads to a decline in happiness, in economic prosperity. And on the community level, people become more introverted, they stay at home more, they watch TV more, they don't engage with their community, they volunteer less, they don't join community organizations, they vote less, but they become more interested in the politics of grievance and victimhood. And because they're not engaging with their community, there becomes the deterioration of the public space. Buildings deteriorate, more vandalism, more crime. And of course, everyone at home knows this is the case because they've seen their towns and cities change beyond all recognition over the last 20 years because of mass immigration, and not in a good way.
What is it to be British? And I believe to be British is to be compassionate, reasonable, live and let live, and diverse. And I am proud to serve our diverse country and all of its parts. It is British to be diverse.